Today, on episode 23 of the Think Wildlife podcast, I will be interviewing Kartik Shanker. He is a faculty at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. His work predominantly covers community ecology and the biogeography of various taxa, including marine invertebrates, fish, reptiles, and birds. He is also the founding trustee of Dakshin Foundation, which is currently working on the natural resource management of coastal communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Anish.
What got you so interested in marine biology?
Well, I think while I was during my undergraduate days when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, I had the good fortune of being in Madras, or Chennai as we now know it, and there'd been a tradition of going on of wildlife enthusiasts and citizens going on turtle walks on the Chennai coast, and uh, actually in the early 70s, Romulus Whitaker and others had established a little hatchery that to protect olive ridley turtle eggs from poaching and predation. And this tradition had been carried on by other state agencies, including the Forest Department. And citizen groups used to go patrolling at night. And so I went along with one of them. And that year, for some reason, the Forest Department decided to close down its hatcheries. So a group of us and foolishly decided to start a students' sea turtle conservation network. And the following year, we had our own hatchery. And I saw my first turtle. So all of that was I think I kind of tipped over into desiring to be an ecologist and B wanting to do something with sea turtles as well.
Currently, a scientist at the Center for Ecological Studies. What is some research you are doing on marine turtles?
So the work that I do here, only a part of it is on marine turtles. About 15 years ago, we started these long-term monitoring programs for sea turtles, various parts of the country. So for olive ridleys in Orissa, leatherbacks in the Andaman Islands, and a few years later, about 2011 or so, on green turtles in Lakshadweep. So we call these our index sites, which are sites that are sort of representative of these populations in that region. And we monitor their populations, including not just the number of, so for ridleys and leatherbacks, the number of nesting turtles. For ridleys, we look at hatchling sex ratios, as that can change in response to climate change. We've done some satellite telemetry on leatherbacks. And on green turtles, we kind of mostly look at the foraging populations in the lagoons in the Lakshadweep. That's the sea turtle oriented work, which is done mostly in collaboration with Dakshin Foundation. But independently of that, in the lab, we work on evolutionary ecology and biogeography, which is looking at the evolutionary history of frogs, lizards, and snakes, large-scale spatial ecology of, again, many groups of vertebrates. We also look at behavior and community ecology of birds and reef fish, and so a range of evolution and ecology projects that we do here as well across a wide range of taxa.
So you mentioned Dakshin Foundation earlier. So why do you start Dakshin Foundation, and what is your long-term vision for this organization?
Before I joined IISc, I was a scientist at an NGO called the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. And we started a coastal and marine program over there. The few of us who were in that program felt that India does not have a civil society organization that is dedicated to coastal and marine conservation, and so we decided that it would provide some value to have an organization that was dedicated to marine conservation. Also, a lot of traditional conservation is about protecting habitats and species and so on, and Italy's own philosophy was about bringing people and conservation together, and we wanted to bring that philosophy to coastal spaces, and perhaps even take it one step further. So you asked what our vision for it was right from the outset, we had programs that dealt with species and habitats, like our Marine Flagships program, which includes the sea turtle work that I just talked about. Um, a fisheries program, which works with fishing communities to monitor resources. But we also had from the outset programs that focused on communities and resource governance, policy, and so on. Now, 15 years later, we've actually flipped the script a little bit, and we're focusing almost much more intensely on people-related issues, where we're hoping through a program we call Sea Change to bring about integrated development across sectors of health, livelihoods, education, and so on in fishing communities, and have positive environmental outcomes almost as a part of the larger sort of package.
So you spoke about the fishery project at Dakshin. Exactly, are sustainable fisheries, and what is their ecological and economical importance?
Well, a sustainable fishery is one that doesn't, result in the declines of the targeted species, right? And this is a sort of very coarse way of putting it, because in many fisheries, the fishery itself may be sustainable, but some individual species may undergo declines or increases. It's not that simple a question. However, I think that the idea of sustainability derives not just from the ecological perspective, but also from the social perspective. So when you want something to be sustainable, you need the social system to be sustainable as well. Very often what happens is that when you have a particular kind of impact, a form of resources extraction, and that's replaced by another, that can often be much worse, right? So in a sense, you want the whole system, both from the social as well as the ecological perspectives, to be sustainable. And to give you one example, one of the areas that we worked in for over 10 years now is the Lakshadweep Islands of the west coast of India, and there for generations they've practiced this pollen line tuna fishery, and the pollen line tuna fishery is considered to be really sustainable because it's very targeted, and it extracts primarily from these tuna populations in a manner that does not or has not at that level of extraction affected those stocks. They mainly take bait fish from the lagoons, and one of the reasons that it's considered to be this really positive fishery is that it reduces the communities don't then harvest heavily from the reef, and healthy reef fish populations, especially healthy herbivore populations, are believed to contribute greatly to the resilience of reefs. So after, for example, bleaching events, there's loss of coral structure, and there's a lot of algal growth, and the herbivores help to keep that algal growth down, and this is believed to contribute to the resilience of those reefs. And one of my colleagues at the Nature Conservation Foundation, Rohan Arthur, actually has been working on the reefs in the Lakshadweep for the last 20 plus years, and he's often referred to tuna as the fish a fish that saved the reef. Now, in that context, we sort of Dakshin started working with tuna fishers to monitor catch, and part of this engagement was not necessary because the tuna fishery itself was not sustainable. They were fishing it unsustainably. However, there are outside pressures, right? There are pressures from outside markets to bring in reef fisheries into the Lakshadweep and change the nature of fisheries. And if these fishers were not getting sufficient income from tuna, they would eventually move to something else. And when you have one set of fishermen moving out of a system, another set of fishermen may move in, and their practices may not be sustainable. So our efforts there really have been to figure out how we can build in managements, help them build management systems that makes that fishery both ecologically, economically, and socially sustainable. And that's sort of, obviously, it's continues to be a work in progress.
Yeah. So moving on more towards marine turtles, why are they considered keystone species?
They considered keystone species for a couple of reasons, I think. One is that um, they do um, play these particular ecological roles. So leatherbacks, for example, feed exclusively on jellyfish. There's an interesting ecological interaction there. Um, People say when, oh, the number of turtles have gone down, so jellyfish will go up and people will suffer. No such ecological interaction is so simple. However, there is evidence that green turtles can graze extensively on seagrass meadows, and in fact, in the Lakshadweep, green turtles have been responsible for destroying most of the seagrass meadows over there. And fishermen don't like them very much because when the meadows are grazed down, then there's no breeding and nursery sites for the bait fish that they need, and so they actually believe that the green turtles have negatively impacted their livelihoods. It is in fact true from the work that we've done, as well as NCF, whom I mentioned earlier, that these turtles have severe negative impacts on seagrass cover and other seagrass characteristics like shoot heights and so on. So when you say keystones, in the conservation sort of circle, keystone is usually looked at as a positive thing. But green turtles, like elephants, can be quite destructive as well. And sometimes we need to understand both the positive impacts as well as the negative impacts that they can have on ecosystems.
What are some of the main threats faced by marine turtles in India?
So historically, turtles, were fished till the 50s and 60s, and so there was large take of adult green turtles from Gulf of Mannar, olive ridleys from Orissa till the 70s. But with the introduction of wildlife protection laws, most of that came to an end. What continued was the take of eggs from beaches, which also has really declined over time. And I would say that the key threats are locally two primary threats, and sort of globally the larger threat of climate change. But locally, there's the more immediate threat of bycatch and fishing. So thousands of turtles get caught in fishing nets in Orissa. That 10,000 turtles plus die each year in fishing nets. Having said that, though, over the last 20 years, we've observed that turtle populations are either stable or probably even increasing. At least at Rushikulia, where we monitor them, they've gone up from the mass nesting numbers. The numbers at each mass nesting event have gone up from 25 to 50,000 to 200,000 plus turtles, right? So I would definitely consider that to be an increase, significant increase, and this seems to be happening despite the thousands of turtles being caught in those nets. So I'm beginning to have to revise whether I even consider that a threat to their populations or just a waste. The most significant threat, in my opinion, is coastal development, because wildlife populations can recover pretty quickly because most of them have breed pretty rapidly. Turtles take a long time to mature, and they're slow growing, so they only breed after 10, 15, 20 years. However, when they do breed, they breed prolifically. So today, there are populations of green turtles in the Caribbean, green turtles in the Lakshadweep, ridleys in Latin America. There's over 1 million ridleys nesting in Mexico alone. So even when they've gone down to pretty small numbers, they can bounce back pretty rapidly if those populations receive some degree of protection. But if the habitats disappear and there's nowhere left for them to nest, then I'm not quite sure what comes next for them. So even though people get much more emotional about seeing dead turtles on the beach and dead turtles caught in nets and so on, I think that's somewhat the lesser threat compared to coastal development, which no one seems to want to oppose because, of course, that's driven by large-scale business and often supported, by government policy as well. And so this large-scale development that's coming up on India's coasts is likely to be the biggest threat, not just to sea turtles, but all nearshore marine ecosystems.
My next question is, What do you think is lacking in marine conservation in India, and how can this be improved?
In general, marine conservation has lagged behind, terrestrial conservation, and this is something we've been saying for the last 15 years. And in a way, that's why we started, Dakshin. Uh, but today, most organizations, most civil society organizations in India do have a marine program. So there's a lot of work, attention. There's more attention today to marine conservation issues than there was 10, 15 years ago. What I think there isn't enough of, and is one is to try and integrate social and environmental issues. I think most conservation organizations try and solve uh, the uh, the ecological or environmental issue in isolation, or through these really conventional and narrow exclusionary approaches of setting aside protected areas and things like that, which, you know in India and globally we've been doing for the last 50 years. And those have limited long-term value, and are in many ways violations of the basic principles of, human rights and environmental justice. And so to move away from those models, and actually embrace social issues. Sure, some NGOs do have some small livelihoods programs and things like that, but to genuinely embrace that and make that part of the solution, I think is lacking largely in marine conservation in India, but is probably lacking in conservation in general around the world. Uh, and the second thing, of course, is to go back to my point about development, which is, I think that the threats that there's a view that, that we can split the world into two parts, and one part we can have development, and the other part we can have conservation, and the two should not overlap with each other. Is, in my opinion, both outdated and unlikely to work. But we need conservation organizations to internalize that. We need the general public to internalize that. We need policymakers and decision makers to internalize that. So that's kind of the, I think, our big large challenge at the moment.
So you also founded Current Conservation. So could you elaborate on the idea behind it and your vision for the future?
Right, that's actually a nice segue, because I think one of the reasons that when I was talking about the challenges, I said that of course, conservationists and practitioners and government and so on need to be think more broadly about conservation issues, but so does the public, right? Because eventually the public does get involved, in the sense that you have influencers, you have people from the public who eventually get into one of these sectors or another, especially young people. So when I say public, that also sort of includes students and potential future stakeholders in these fields. Uh, and not to leave out, of course, the primary stakeholders on the ground. Current conservation was a way to reach out to the larger public on issues of conservation, because we did feel that, again, to sort of reiterate that point, that a lot of the wildlife ecology conservation magazines are very wildlife ecology centric, right? So if you pick up one of these traditional popular magazines, it's very much about the species of animal or plant or whatever, these usually decked with these spectacular wildlife photographs on the cover and inside. And we felt that conservation, that's a very um, uh, narrow way to present the the sort of the diversity of nature and our relationship with it to the world. And so in a way, current conservation was started to present a broader view of conservation, but also to present more rigorous science-based. When I say science, I mean both ecology and social science based perspectives and narratives. And to that end, so for example, most of our writers, in fact, are most of our contributions come from the academic community, and we work with them to make the articles more engaging for the public. We use artwork for that. And uh, we have partnerships with organizations like the Society for Conservation Biology, through which we try and improve the reach of the conservation science that's produced in the academic world, to a much broader public.
So my final question for you is that what has been your greatest learning from your conservation career?
My greatest learning, and this might sound a bit, you know, uh, either contrarian or controversial or provocative, but I think conservation is, uh, the conservation movement is um, either a failure or doomed to failure. And I think the reason for that is that we've looked upon it as this separate thing from us. Uh, I think conservation needs to be integrated into, or environmental issues need to be integrated into our general sense of human well-being. And this goes for whether it's the local fishing community or the farmer that we work with, or whether it goes for the urban city dweller, like many of us are. So I think this lack of integration of these issues is what I think one day we'll look back at conservation as a movement that had its moment, and perhaps triggered some interesting thoughts, but in and of itself failed to achieve what its goals were. And so my learning, in a sense, is that we should abandon at least the term conservation, and for the larger part, with communities, we don't talk about it as conservation at all. But embedded in our well-being are all of these issues of our health and of our livelihoods, but also of the air we breathe and what we eat, and so on, right? So in a way, we can, it might seem an overly anthropocentric way of looking at it, but I'm quite happy to include what a famous environmental philosopher called cultural anthropocentrism, which is the idea that you can love animals, and that's also one of the ways that we use them, and all of these uses are non-exclusionary. So I think a sense of well-being that includes using nature, being with nature, all of that. If we can integrate that, then we don't need conservation anymore. Um, when I say, my favorite phrase is I love fish, uh, and that's so much more broad-minded than saying something like I love turtles, because uh, the phrase I love turtles will almost always be interpreted as, I like how they look, or how they live, or I love doing research on them. I love fish can mean anything. It can mean I love watching fish. I love studying fish. I love eating fish. And so for me, it's a brilliantly neutral term that captures what conservation should be about.
That's a very interesting way to end this interview. Thank you again for your time. It's a really big pleasure speaking to you.
Pleasure speaking to you, Anish. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed the podcast, don't forget to give us a follow on whichever platform you are listening on. Also, there are ways to support community based conservation from wherever you are. Just simply visit the links below and buy products from our alternative livelihood projects. 90% of the revenue is sent directly to the local communities, providing them more sustainable sources of income.